The cruelest betrayals never arrive with a warning. They arrive with applause. The organ music swelled beneath the vaulted ceiling of St. Bartholomew's, rich and triumphant, as 200 guests turned their expectant faces toward the entrance, waiting for Ethan Harrington to claim his bride. Instead, the church doors opened to a trembling courier clutching a sealed envelope, snow melting across his dark coat and pooling on polished marble floors. Claire Whitmore stood at the altar in ivory silk, her gloved hands resting lightly around a bouquet of winter roses, and even before the letter was placed into her father's shaking grip, she felt it, that subtle shift in the air when hope begins to fracture. The whisper started in the back pews and rolled forward like distant thunder. Ethan would not be coming. He had chosen opportunity over devotion, wealth over promise, a richer heiress whose name tasted like silver and strategy. Claire did not gasp. She did not sway. She simply lifted her chin as her father's voice faltered mid-sentence, and the words dissolved into a stunned silence that seemed to stretch for miles. Every eye in the church burned against her skin, waiting for tears, for humiliation, for collapse. Instead, she inhaled slowly, as though steadying herself against a winter wind, and folded her hands together so no one could see how they trembled beneath lace. Somewhere near the back aisle, a tall figure moved, deliberate and unhurried, boots echoing softly against stone. Alexander Harrington had not planned to attend his brother's wedding, but envy had always followed him like a shadow, and today it had led him here. He had watched Ethan charm rooms with careless smiles, watched him collect admiration as though it were owed, watched him speak of Claire as if she were an arrangement rather than a woman. Now he watched the arrangement crumble. When he reached the front of the church, the murmurs sharpened, curious and uneasy. Snow still clung to the shoulders of his charcoal coat, dissolving slowly into darkened wool. His gray eyes did not seek his brother. They found Claire. For a suspended heartbeat, neither spoke. In that silence lay everything unspoken over the past year. The quiet glances at charity galas, the restrained nods across crowded ballrooms, the sense that he had seen something in her his brother never bothered to notice. Claire met his gaze, expecting sympathy. What she saw, instead, was resolve. Alexander turned to the congregation first, his voice measured, deep, steady enough to cut through speculation. "If a Harrington cannot honor his word," he said, "then another will." The words landed like a match against dry timber. Gasps rippled through the pews. Claire's pulse hammered in her ears, louder than the organ, louder than the whispers. She felt the weight of reputation, of expectation, of every cruel prediction already forming beyond those stained-glass windows. Alexander extended his hand, not commanding, not possessive, simply open. "Miss Whitmore," he said softly now, just for her. "No one will ever stand alone in this room again." And for the first time since the letter was delivered, Claire's breath caught, not from humiliation, but from the dangerous, undeniable possibility that this was not the end of her story, but the moment it truly began. The silence did not shatter at once. It thinned slowly, like ice under careful pressure. Claire felt every breath in the church turn toward her as Alexander's hand remained extended between them, steady and unyielding. Somewhere to her left, her mother's gloved fingers tightened around a handkerchief. Her father stood motionless, the unopened letter still crushed in his grasp as though it might rearrange itself into a kinder message. Claire lowered her gaze to Alexander's hand. It was not a demand. It was an offer. That difference alone felt monumental. She could hear the whispers now, sharpened and urgent. He is doing this out of spite. He wants to embarrass his brother. She is desperate enough to accept. The words circled her like winter wind. Claire had spent her life understanding what people expected from her. Smile. Agree. Endure. Today, she surprised even herself. She placed her bouquet into her maid of honor's trembling hands and stepped forward. The soft rustle of silk echoed through the nave as she reached for Alexander's hand. His fingers closed around hers, warm despite the lingering chill from outside. Not possessive, protective. The contact sent a tremor through her that had nothing to do with fear. Alexander turned toward the minister, his expression composed, almost severe, but Claire sensed something beneath it, a current of resolve that ran deeper than wounded pride. "Reverend," he said calmly, "if Miss Whitmore is willing, I am prepared to proceed." The audacity of it struck the room like a spark in dry timber. A wedding transformed in less than 60 seconds. A family name salvaged in one decisive motion. Claire's heart pounded so loudly she was certain the front pew could hear it. She should hesitate. She should question his motives. Instead, she lifted her chin once more and spoke clearly. I am willing. The words felt like stepping off a cliff and discovering solid ground beneath her feet. A murmur of disbelief rippled outward. At the back of the church, the heavy doors opened again. This time the entrance did not carry snow. It carried fury disguised as charm. Ethan Harrington strode in with calculated urgency, dark hair perfectly in place, expression carefully arranged to suggest regret rather than guilt. He paused when he saw their joined hands. For the first time in his life, he was not the center of the room. What is the meaning of this? He demanded, his voice strained but controlled. Alexander did not release Claire. He did not even look at his brother. It means, he replied evenly, that some promises still matter. The temperature in the church seemed to drop 10 degrees. Claire felt Ethan's gaze on her, sharp and disbelieving, as though she had altered the script without permission. For months he had treated her affection like an accessory. Now she stood beside the man he had envied since childhood. Not for wealth, not for title, but for integrity. Claire did not look at Ethan. She refused to give him the satisfaction of witnessing her pain. Instead, she focused on the steady rhythm of Alexander's breathing beside her. The minister cleared his throat, uncertain but resolute, and began to speak again. Outside, snow drifted softly against stained glass. Inside, a new story was being written in real time. And for the first time that day, Claire felt something dangerously close to power. The vows were spoken with a steadiness that did not match the storm of whispers rising behind them. Claire heard each word as though from a great distance, her pulse counting the seconds between promises that had not existed an hour ago. Alexander's voice did not waver when he repeated the sacred lines. He did not rush. He did not glance toward his brother. He spoke as though this moment had been inevitable. When it was Claire's turn, the air felt thin, fragile as glass. She did not think of humiliation now. She did not think of gossip columns or drawing rooms. She thought only of the hand that had not let go. I do, she said, and the words rang clear beneath the high arches, firm enough to silence the last cruel whisper. Ethan's composure fractured then, not into rage, but into disbelief. He stepped forward, careful to maintain dignity before the crowd. Claire, he said, lowering his voice as though intimacy could still be claimed, this is unnecessary. You are upset. We can speak privately. She turned toward him at last. Her expression was not wounded. It was calm. We have already spoken, she replied softly. You simply did not listen. A faint murmur of approval stirred near the front pews. Alexander's jaw tightened, but he remained still, allowing her voice to carry its own weight. Ethan's gaze flicked between them, calculating. For years he had competed with his brother in subtle ways that polite society never acknowledged. Today the competition had become undeniable. You think this is about honor? Ethan asked Alexander, attempting a dismissive laugh. You are acting on impulse. Alexander met his brother's eyes for the first time. The look he gave was not heated. It was final. No, he answered evenly. I am acting on principle. The minister completed the ceremony with visible caution, yet with conviction. Rings were exchanged, cool bands of gold catching candlelight. When Alexander slid the ring onto Claire's finger, his touch lingered for half a second longer than required. Not to claim, to reassure. Outside, the snowfall softened, drifting gently against stained glass painted in jewel tones. Inside, the congregation slowly rose, uncertain whether to applaud or retreat. Claire felt the weight of her new name settle around her like a cloak. It was not the name she had expected that morning, yet it did not feel foreign. Ethan stepped back, the careful mask returning to his features. This is not finished, he said quietly, too low for the crowd to hear, but clear enough for them. Claire did not flinch. It is finished, she replied. The certainty in her tone surprised even her. Alexander offered his arm, and she accepted it without hesitation. As they walked down the aisle together, the echo of their steps replaced the earlier whispers. Guests parted instinctively, some in shock, some in reluctant admiration. Claire felt the shift in the room, subtle yet undeniable. She had not been discarded. She had chosen. At the heavy wooden doors, Alexander paused, leaning slightly closer so only she could hear. "I will not regret this," he said quietly. It was not a boast. It was a promise. Claire searched his face, finding no trace of triumph, only a steady resolve that both steadied and unsettled her. As the doors opened and winter light spilled across the marble floor, she realized that the true storm had not passed. It had only changed direction, and this time, she was no longer standing alone at its center. The winter light felt sharper outside the church, almost blinding against the untouched snow that covered the stone steps and the waiting line of black carriages. Claire paused at the top of the staircase, her hand still resting lightly on Alexander's arm, aware that 200 pairs of eyes followed them through the tall doors. The cold air brushed against her flushed cheeks, carrying the scent of pine and distant smoke. For a fleeting second, she wondered if she had stepped into someone else's life. Alexander guided her carefully down the steps, steady and deliberate, as though every movement mattered. At the bottom, his driver opened the carriage door without a word. The Harrington crest gleamed in silver against polished black wood, a symbol of legacy and expectation. Claire felt its weight more than the gold band newly circling her finger. Behind them, the church doors opened again. Ethan emerged into the winter glare, his posture rigid, his expression composed for the watching crowd. He did not call out this time. He did not create another spectacle. Instead, he stood there, hands folded behind his back, studying the carriage that now belonged to his brother's future. Claire sensed his gaze without turning around. It was no longer anger that radiated from him. It was calculation. Alexander helped her into the carriage with quiet courtesy, his touch brief but grounding. When he stepped inside and the door closed, the noise of the world softened to a distant murmur. The interior smelled faintly of leather and cedar. For a moment, neither spoke. The horses began to move, hooves crunching over fresh snow, carrying them away from the church and everything it had represented just 1 hour earlier. Claire folded her hands in her lap, watching the landscape shift through the frosted window. Bare trees stretched against a pale sky, there. Branches like ink against parchment. "You may still reconsider," Alexander said at last, his voice low but steady. "If you feel pressured, I will not hold you to a decision made under scrutiny." She turned toward him, surprised by the absence of triumph in his tone. There was no trace of victory, only concern. "Do you regret it?" she asked softly. His gaze met hers, unguarded for the first time that day. "No," he answered. "I regret that I did not act sooner." The carriage rocked gently over a mile of uneven road as silence settled between them again, but it was no longer heavy. It was thoughtful. Claire studied the man beside her, seeing past the composed exterior to something quieter and more resolute. He had not rescued her out of rivalry. He had stepped forward because he believed she deserved better. The realization stirred something fragile, yet undeniable within her. The Harrington estate rose in the distance soon after, sprawling across acres of winter fields, its stone facade both imposing and austere. Tall windows reflected the muted afternoon light, and smoke curled faintly from the chimneys. As the carriage approached the circular drive, Claire felt the true weight of what she had done. She was no longer the woman left waiting at an altar. She was the wife of the man her former fiancé had envied his entire life. And somewhere behind them, in a city already buzzing with speculation, a rivalry that had once been quiet had just become impossible to ignore. The Harrington estate did not welcome with warmth, it welcomed with silence. As the carriage rolled beneath the stone archway and came to a gradual stop, Claire felt the magnitude of the place press against her senses. The mansion stretched wide across the winter landscape, 3 stories of gray stone and tall windows that reflected the pale afternoon sky. It was not ostentatious. It was enduring. The front doors opened before Alexander could knock, revealing a line of household staff standing in quiet formation. Their expressions were carefully neutral, but curiosity shimmered beneath discipline. News traveled faster than snow in a town like this. Alexander stepped down first and turned, offering his hand once more. Claire accepted it, steadying herself as her boots touched the gravel drive. The wind tugged lightly at the edge of her veil, and for a brief moment, she felt suspended between 2 lives. "Welcome home," Alexander said quietly, the words deliberate, as though he understood their weight. Inside, The entrance hall rose 2 stories high, a sweeping staircase curving upward beneath a crystal chandelier. The air carried a faint scent of polished wood and distant fireplace smoke. Portraits of past generations lined the walls, their painted gazes solemn and unwavering. Claire sensed that they were measuring her already. The butler stepped forward, his posture impeccable. "Congratulations, sir," he said, inclining his head. His eyes shifted respectfully to Claire. "Mrs. Harrington." The title landed differently than she expected. It did not feel borrowed. It felt earned. Alexander gave brief instructions in a calm, efficient tone. Luggage would be taken to the East Wing. A light supper would be served in the small dining room. No announcement was to be sent to the press without his approval. Claire listened carefully, recognizing that the outside world would not remain silent for long. Once the staff dispersed, a stillness settled between them. The vastness of the hall seemed to magnify it. Alexander turned to her, removing his gloves slowly, as though choosing his words with equal care. "I will have the guest suite prepared for you," he said. "You deserve time to rest. Today has been significant." She searched his expression, detecting the restraint behind his composed exterior. "And you?" she asked softly. "Where will you be?" He hesitated, just slightly. "In my study. There are matters to address." The rivalry that had once been subtle now felt tangible. She could almost hear the echo of Ethan's measured voice from earlier, the quiet promise that this was not finished. Claire walked slowly toward the grand staircase, her fingers brushing the banister's smooth wood. Each step upward felt symbolic, a climb not into privilege, but into responsibility. At the landing, she paused and looked down at Alexander standing alone in the center of the hall, shoulders squared beneath the chandelier's light. For a man who commanded acres of land and countless decisions, he looked unexpectedly solitary. He sensed her gaze and glanced up. For a fleeting moment, something softened in his eyes. Not triumph, not regret, something closer to relief. Claire realized then that this marriage was not merely an act of defiance. It was a beginning neither of them had fully anticipated. Outside, the winter sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the frozen fields. Inside the Harrington estate, the true test of their choice was only just beginning. The East Wing was warmer than Claire expected, but warmth did not quiet her thoughts. A fire had already been lit in the marble hearth, its soft glow dancing across pale blue walls and tall windows that overlooked nearly 50 acres of frost-covered fields. A maid carefully removed her veil and wedding gloves, moving with respectful silence. Yet Claire felt the unspoken question in every glance. How long will this last? When the door closed and she was finally alone, the stillness pressed in. She moved toward the window and rested her palm against the cool glass. The Harrington estate stretched outward in disciplined symmetry, rows of bare trees lining a long driveway that disappeared beyond iron gates. Somewhere past those gates, the city was already speaking her name, not in admiration, in speculation. A quiet knock interrupted her thoughts. "Mrs. Harrington," the maid said gently from the doorway. "Your husband requests your presence in the small dining room when you are ready." The word husband still felt unfamiliar, but it did not feel wrong. Claire changed into a simple ivory evening dress, the fabric softer and less ceremonial than the gown she had worn that morning. She studied her reflection only briefly. The woman staring back at her looked composed, but beneath the calm was something newly awakened. When she descended the staircase, the chandelier light shimmered faintly across polished wood floors. The small dining room was intimate compared to the grandeur of the entrance hall. A table set for two stood near a window where twilight pressed softly against the glass. Candles flickered between crystal glasses, casting long shadows. Alexander stood as she entered. He had removed his coat, his posture less rigid now, though tension lingered around his shoulders. "I was not certain you would come," he admitted quietly. Claire met his gaze and took her seat across from him. "We both made a decision today," she replied. "It would be unwise to avoid it." A faint trace of something like admiration crossed his expression. Dinner was simple but thoughtful, roasted chicken, warm bread, and a pot of tea that steamed gently between them. For several minutes, they spoke of practical matters. Her family would be invited to stay if needed. The press would be handled with restraint. Financial arrangements would be transparent. It sounded almost like a business meeting, Yet beneath each sentence lay something far less calculated. At last, Alexander set down his glass. "You should know," he said, his voice lowering slightly. This was never about defeating him. Claire studied him carefully. "Then why did you step forward?" The question hung between them, honest and unguarded. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he held her gaze in a way that felt deliberate. "Because I have watched you be underestimated for too long," he said. "And I will not stand by while it happens again." The fire crackled softly behind her. Claire felt the words settle deep within her chest, not as flattery, but as recognition. Outside, the last light faded across the fields, and the estate grew quieter with each passing minute. Yet within the walls of the Harrington home, something steadier than rivalry was beginning to take shape. Not sudden passion, not impulsive defiance. Something slower, something chosen. And in that quiet dining room, beneath the glow of candlelight and the weight of a new name, Claire realized that the most dangerous shift of all was not the rivalry they had ignited, but the trust that was beginning to form between them. The estate slept lightly that night, as though even the walls understood that something irreversible had shifted within them. Claire stood alone in the East Wing's sitting room, a single candle burning low beside her, its flame bending each time the winter wind pressed faintly against the window panes. The house was quiet, yet her thoughts were not. Marriage had come to her not with celebration, but with decision. And decisions had consequences. A soft knock sounded at her door, deliberate and measured. She did not startle this time. "Come in," she called gently. Alexander entered without haste, closing the door behind him as though guarding the moment from interruption. He had removed his jacket. The stiffness of the day softened into something more human. In the muted candlelight, the tension in his expression was more visible. "I received a message," he said, holding a folded sheet of paper loosely in one hand. "It was delivered an hour ago." Claire felt her pulse steady rather than quicken. "From him," she said, not as a question. Alexander inclined his head once. "He requests a private meeting tomorrow afternoon. He claims there are matters of inheritance and reputation that require clarification." The phrasing was polished. The intent was not. Claire walked toward the fireplace, the hem of her dress brushing softly against the carpet. "He will attempt to turn this into negotiation," she said quietly. "He believes everything can be bartered." Alexander watched her closely, not interrupting. The firelight caught in his eyes, reflecting something that looked less like rivalry and more like protectiveness. "You are under no obligation to see him," he said. "I can refuse on your behalf." Claire turned back toward him. The shadows on the wall seemed taller now, stretching behind them like silent witnesses. "No," she replied. "If he wishes to speak, he may speak. But he will not dictate the terms." The certainty in her tone surprised neither of them. For years she had been measured against expectations designed by others. Today she had rewritten them. Alexander stepped closer, not invading her space, but narrowing the distance between them. "I will be present," he said firmly. "Not to speak for you, only to ensure that no one questions your position again." The words settled between them, heavy with intention. Claire studied his face in the shifting light. There was no calculation there, no strategy for victory, only resolve. "You do not have to fight every battle for me," she said softly. He held her gaze without hesitation. "I know," he answered, "but I will stand beside you in every one." The room seemed smaller then, not because of proximity, but because of understanding. Outside, snow began to fall again, fine and steady, blanketing the long driveway in white. Tomorrow would bring confrontation. Tomorrow would bring scrutiny. But tonight, in the quiet east wing of a house that had not expected a new mistress, something steadier took root. Not defiance, not impulse, partnership. And as the candle flame flickered between them, Claire realized that the rivalry threatening their peace was no longer the greatest uncertainty before her. The greater question was whether she was ready to trust the man who had chosen her without hesitation. And for the first time since the church doors had opened, she felt ready to try. Morning arrived without softness. Frost traced delicate patterns across the tall windows of the east wing, and the sky beyond the estate lay pale and unwelcoming, as though the day itself anticipated confrontation. Claire stood before the mirror while her maid fastened the final button of a deep blue dress, its cut modest but commanding. She chose it deliberately, not bridal white, not fragile pastels, blue, the color of steadiness. When she descended the staircase, the entrance hall felt different from the night before. Staff moved with quiet efficiency, yet their glances lingered a second longer. News had traveled. By noon, the iron gates at the end of the mile-long drive opened to admit a single dark carriage. Claire watched from the second-floor landing as it rolled toward the house, wheels crunching against frost-hardened gravel. She did not need to ask who had arrived. Alexander joined her at the railing, his presence calm but unmistakably resolute. He did not speak. He simply stood beside her, shoulder aligned with hers, an unspoken confirmation of everything he had promised. When the carriage door opened, Ethan stepped out with measured grace, dressed impeccably, as though attending a social call rather than a reckoning. His gaze lifted immediately to the house, calculating the windows, the symmetry, the position of power he had once assumed would be his by proximity. The front doors opened before he could knock. The butler escorted him into the small receiving room, where sunlight filtered weakly through tall panes. Claire entered first. She did not rush. She did not hesitate. Alexander followed, remaining a quiet presence near the fireplace. Ethan inclined his head politely. "You look well," he said to Claire, his tone controlled. "Given the circumstances." She met his eyes without hostility. "The circumstances were clarified yesterday," she replied. "I believe that was your intention." A faint flicker of irritation crossed his features, quickly concealed. "I made a decision based on opportunity," he said. "It was never personal." The words fell flat in the cool room. Claire felt the calm within her solidify. "It was personal to me," she answered evenly. Silence stretched for several seconds. Ethan shifted his focus to Alexander. "This rivalry has gone too far," he said, attempting reason. "You have always been eager to outshine me." Alexander's expression did not change. "This was never about shining," he replied quietly. "It was about standing." The distinction hung heavy in the air. Ethan's composure faltered for the briefest moment. "The heiress's family expects alignment," he continued. "Our father's investments rely on cooperation. This sudden marriage complicates matters." Claire understood then. This was not an apology. It was leverage. She stepped forward, placing both hands lightly on the back of a chair, grounding herself in certainty. "You are concerned about perception," she said calmly, "not about what you discarded." Ethan's jaw tightened. He had expected hurt. He had expected negotiation. He had not expected clarity. Alexander spoke at last, his voice measured and final. "The Harrington estate does not operate on coercion. Whatever alliances you pursue them without using her name." The fire cracked softly behind him, punctuating the statement. Ethan looked between them, recognizing for the first time that the ground beneath him had shifted. Claire was no longer waiting for his approval. She had chosen her position. And as the winter light poured into the receiving room, illuminating the space between the three of them, it became clear that envy had finally met something it could not manipulate. The door closed behind Ethan with a restraint that felt louder than a slam. The echo of his departure lingered in the receiving room long after the carriage wheels faded down the mile-long drive. Claire remained standing beside the chair, her hands still resting against polished wood, as though the conversation had required physical steadiness. For a few seconds, neither she nor Alexander moved. The silence was no longer tense. It was contemplative. "He will not stop," Alexander said at last, his voice quiet but certain. Claire nodded once. "He does not know how to." She walked slowly toward the window, watching as the iron gates at the edge of the property closed again, sealing the estate in deliberate finality. The winter air outside looked sharper now, the sky a pale gray stretched over acres of frost-covered ground. Somewhere beyond those fields, Ethan would already be recalculating his position. Claire understood him well enough to know that humiliation, even subtle humiliation, was not something he tolerated easily. Alexander approached, but did not crowd her space. "If he attempts to involve your family," he said carefully, "I will intervene." She turned to face him, searching his expression for doubt. There was none, only resolve. "My family will not be used as leverage," she replied. "They have endured enough speculation." The fire behind them crackled softly, a steady rhythm in contrast to the uncertainty outside their walls. Claire realized something unexpected then. She was not afraid. The confrontation had not weakened her. It had clarified her. Ethan's arrival had been meant to destabilize, to reopen wounds. Instead, it had exposed the simplicity of his motives. Opportunity. Image. Advantage. Alexander rested one hand lightly against the mantel, his posture composed yet alert. You handled him with more composure than I anticipated, he admitted. A faint smile touched her lips, subtle but real. He expected regret, she said. I do not regret. The words settled between them like a vow separate from the one spoken in church. Outside, a thin layer of sunlight broke through the overcast sky, illuminating the fields in a muted glow. It was not warmth, but it was light. Alexander studied her for a moment longer than propriety required. There will be a gathering next week, he said. Our associates will attend. They will be curious. Claire understood immediately. Public confirmation. Public strength. Then we will attend, she replied without hesitation. Together. He inclined his head, accepting the answer as partnership rather than obligation. In that quiet room, something shifted again, less dramatic than a wedding, less sharp than confrontation, yet more enduring. Trust, no longer tentative, began to take shape. The rivalry that had once defined two brothers now felt smaller against the steadiness forming between husband and wife. As the afternoon light strengthened and the estate returned to its measured routine, Claire felt the weight of her new life settle not as burden, but as choice. And in choosing, she realized, she had done more than escape humiliation. She had stepped into a future where envy no longer dictated her worth. The announcement was sent 3 days later, embossed in silver and delivered by hand, to every influential household within a 20-mile radius. It was not extravagant. It was deliberate. Claire stood beside the tall window in Alexander's study as he sealed the final envelope with the Harrington crest, the wax cooling beneath his steady hand. Outside, the frozen fields shimmered under a thin layer of sunlight, deceptively calm. Inside, strategy replaced speculation. Once this is delivered, he said quietly, there will be no room for rumor. Only fact. Claire stepped closer to the desk, observing the precise handwriting that bore her new name with quiet authority. She felt no tremor when she read it. Mrs. Claire Harrington. It was no longer unfamiliar. It was anchored. Let them see, she replied. Let them measure what they believed would fail. Alexander looked up at her, something like pride flickering across his expression, though he did not name it. The gathering will be held here, he said. Not in the city. On our ground. The choice was intentional. To host was to command. To command was to define the narrative. Over the next 48 hours, the estate shifted into quiet preparation. Crystal was polished. Silver was laid out in careful symmetry. Invitations were acknowledged with cautious enthusiasm. Claire moved through the halls with a steadiness that surprised even the staff. She did not retreat into the east wing. She did not allow whispers to corner her. Instead, she learned the rhythms of the household, the names of those who served within it, the histories tied to its walls. On the morning of the gathering, frost still clung to the gardens, but the sky had cleared into a hard blue expanse. By dusk, carriages began to arrive one by one, wheels tracing measured arcs along the circular drive. Claire descended the staircase in a gown of deep emerald silk, understated yet unmistakable. The chandelier light caught along the fabric as though affirming her presence. Alexander met her at the foot of the stairs. He offered his arm not as ceremony, but as alignment. Are you prepared? He asked quietly. She held his gaze. I am not afraid, she answered. The doors opened, and the murmur of arriving guests filled the entrance hall. Polite smiles masked curiosity. Subtle glances measured distance between husband and wife. Claire felt each observation like a passing draft of air, cool, but no longer chilling. Conversations hushed slightly when she entered the main salon beside Alexander. Wine glasses paused midair. Laughter softened into expectation. Somewhere across the room, she noticed a familiar silhouette. Ethan had come, accompanied by the wealthy heiress whose fortune had once been paraded as triumph. He did not approach immediately. He watched. Claire did not avert her eyes. She inclined her head with composed acknowledgement, neither inviting nor dismissing him. Alexander's hand tightened almost imperceptibly around hers, not possessive, but steady. This is where perception shifts, he murmured. Claire lifted her chin, allowing her presence to speak before any word was uttered. The music began softly in the corner of the room, strings weaving a quiet melody beneath layered conversation. Tonight was not about defiance. It was about confirmation. And as the guests gradually resumed their exchanges, addressing her not with pity but with measured respect, Claire understood that the rivalry that once sought to diminish her had instead elevated her. On this ground, beneath these chandeliers, she was no longer the woman left waiting. She was the woman chosen, and she had chosen in return. The music grew louder as more guests filled the salon, crystal glasses catching the chandelier light like scattered stars. Claire moved with deliberate grace beside Alexander, greeting each arrival with composed warmth. She noticed the subtle change in tone when people addressed her now. There was no longer speculation in their eyes. There was assessment, yes, but also recognition. She was not a discarded bride rescued out of impulse. She was the mistress of this estate. Across the room, Ethan finally approached, Victoria Ashbury at his side in pale silver silk that shimmered with calculated elegance. The heiress offered a polite smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Congratulations," she said, her tone carefully measured. The announcement was unexpected. Claire met her gaze without flinching. "So was the wedding," she replied evenly. The exchange was courteous, but the undercurrent was unmistakable. Ethan's expression remained controlled, yet there was a sharpness beneath it. "You have turned quite the narrative in your favor," he said quietly, stepping closer so that only Claire and Alexander could hear. Alexander did not move away. "Truth has a way of doing that," he answered calmly. For a moment, the four of them stood in a delicate balance of rivalry and reputation. Guests nearby pretended not to listen, though every ear was attuned. Ethan's gaze shifted to Claire again. "You could have chosen differently," he said, almost as though testing her resolve. Claire felt the weight of that statement and recognized the invitation within it. Regret, doubt, reconsideration. She did not accept it. "I did choose," she replied. The simplicity of her words carried more force than any accusation. Victoria adjusted the diamond bracelet at her wrist, the subtle gesture revealing impatience. "We should not overshadow the evening," she said smoothly, though her eyes flickered toward the growing circle of onlookers. Alexander inclined his head politely. "This evening belongs to the estate," he said, "and to the future it represents." The music shifted into a slow waltz, and couples began to move toward the open space in the center of the room. Without hesitation, Alexander extended his hand to Claire. She accepted. The first steps were measured and controlled, their movements aligned as though practiced long before this night. The room seemed to exhale as they crossed the floor together. Conversations resumed, but now with a different tone. Ethan remained at the edge of the dance floor, watching. Claire did not look at him again. She focused instead on the steady rhythm guiding her steps, on the hand at her waist that neither claimed nor restrained but supported. "You are aware he will not concede easily," Alexander murmured softly. "Neither will I," she replied. The words were not defiant. They were assured. As the dance carried them beneath the glow of crystal light and quiet admiration, the narrative that had once threatened to diminish her dissolved completely. The rivalry that had begun with envy now stood exposed before witnesses who could see the truth without embellishment. And in the center of the salon, beneath music and murmured respect, Claire understood that the most powerful shift of all was not in how others viewed her. It was in how she now viewed herself. The final note of the waltz lingered in the air long after the music softened, as though the room itself hesitated to break the spell. Claire felt the warmth of movement fade slowly as Alexander guided her back toward the edge of the salon. Applause followed, polite but genuine. It was not for spectacle. It was for certainty. She sensed it in the measured nods from guests who had arrived curious and now remained convinced. Crystal chandeliers shimmered overhead, scattering light across polished floors and the gathered faces of those who had come to witness more than a celebration. They had come to witness outcome. Ethan stepped forward once more, no longer concealed by distance. Victoria remained slightly behind him, her posture composed but watchful. "It seems," Ethan began evenly, "that perception has shifted more quickly than expected." His voice carried enough volume to be overheard by those nearest, yet restrained enough to avoid overt confrontation. Claire faced him fully, the emerald silk of her gown catching the light like quiet armor. "Perception adjusts when truth is visible," she replied. There was no accusation in her tone, only clarity. A subtle ripple moved through the surrounding guests. They were listening now without pretense. Ethan's gaze flickered briefly to Alexander, then returned to Claire. Our father's associates will interpret this as division, he said. They may question stability. Alexander answered before Claire needed to. Stability is not threatened by integrity, he said calmly. It is threatened by inconsistency. The distinction settled heavily in the air. Ethan's composure tightened. For years he had relied on charm and timing to control narratives. Tonight those tools felt insufficient. Victoria's hand rested lightly on his arm, a gesture meant to steady, yet it appeared more like restraint. Claire sensed the shift in power not as triumph, but as inevitability. She stepped closer, closing the remaining space with quiet authority. This gathering was never meant to embarrass you, she said. It was meant to confirm our position. That is all. The honesty of her statement removed the drama from his protest. Around them, conversations resumed with renewed confidence. A few guests even approached to offer congratulations once more, reinforcing the direction the evening had taken. Ethan glanced around the room, recognizing that the silent verdict had already been delivered. His voice lowered, no longer aimed at an audience. You believe this ends rivalry, he said softly. Claire met his eyes without hesitation. I believe it ends misunderstanding. The difference was subtle, yet absolute. Alexander's presence beside her remained unwavering, not confrontational, simply firm. After a final measured pause, Ethan inclined his head slightly, a gesture that acknowledged more than words could. Then I wish you clarity, he said. It was not blessing. It was concession. As he stepped back and turned away, the tension that had threaded through the evening began to dissolve. Claire exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of scrutiny lift from her shoulders. Alexander leaned closer, his voice quiet enough that only she could hear. You did not yield, he said. She allowed herself a faint smile. I did not need to. The music resumed, lighter now, and laughter gradually returned to the room. Beneath the glow of chandeliers and the steady rhythm of conversation, the rivalry that had once defined two brothers faded into something smaller, less commanding. What remained was steadier than victory. It was respect, earned openly and witnessed by all. The final guests departed near midnight, their carriages disappearing one by one down the frost-silver drive until the estate returned to stillness. The chandeliers were dimmed, the music silenced, and only the low murmur of embers in the fireplace remained. Claire stood, alone for a moment in the now quiet salon, the echo of conversation lingering like perfume in the air. Tonight had not been loud. It had been decisive. Footsteps approached behind her, measured and familiar. Alexander did not speak immediately. He joined her at the window, where moonlight stretched across the fields in a pale, endless glow. They will speak of this evening, he said at last. His tone carried neither pride nor apprehension, only certainty. Claire watched the distant line of trees etched against the sky. Let them, she replied softly. For once, the story is accurate. He turned toward her then, the candlelight catching the quiet intensity in his eyes. I did not ask you earlier, he said, voice lowered, but I will ask now. Are you content with what we chose? The question was not strategic. It was vulnerable. Claire faced him fully, no guests to observe, no rivals to measure their distance. Only truth. She considered the weight of the past week. The church doors opening, the letter, the outstretched hand, the confrontation, the dance. Each moment had carried risk, yet none had felt false. I am not content because it was easy, she answered slowly. I am content because it was right. The fire behind them shifted, casting warm light across polished wood and marble. Alexander stepped closer, not out of impulse, but intention. I did not step forward to defy him, he said quietly. I stepped forward because I have admired your strength for longer than I allowed myself to admit. The admission settled between them with more gravity than any public declaration. Claire felt her breath steady rather than falter. And I did not accept your hand to prove anything, she replied. I accepted it because you offered respect when I was shown none. Silence followed, but it was no longer uncertain. It was shared. Outside, the winter air moved gently across the acres of land that now bore both their names. Within these walls, rivalry had lost its urgency. What remained was steadier than competition and stronger than pride. Alexander extended his hand once more, not in rescue, not in defiance, but in quiet invitation. Claire placed her hand in his without hesitation. This time there was no audience, no witnesses, only two people who had chosen to stand rather than retreat. The estate around them seemed less imposing now, less like inheritance and more like foundation. As the last ember flickered low and the moonlight deepened across the fields, Claire understood something she had not recognized at the altar. Love did not arrive as spectacle. It arrived as alignment. And sometimes, the greatest victories were not won by defeating another, but by refusing to be diminished. In the quiet of the Harrington estate, beneath a sky wide enough to hold every rumor and every truth, two lives began not in rivalry, but in resolve.